Nobody's dying today. The crowd formed a perfect circle around her. Not to help, but to watch. Lila Hart knelt in the dirt outside Morton's General Store, blood soaking through her dress, contractions tearing through her body like fire. Her 7-year-old daughter clutched her 4-year-old brother, both children frozen in terror. The sheriff leaned against a post, arms crossed. The doctor stood on the boardwalk, shaking his head. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Boots appeared at the edge of her vision, worn leather, dust-caked, belonging to a man the town didn't know. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. Nobody's dying today. Welcome to a story of courage born from cruelty, redemption forged in fire, and love that refused to die in the dirt. If this story moves you, please like this video and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Lila's story travels. Now let's begin. The summer of 1887 came to Willow Creek, Wyoming like a sickness, slow, heavy, and mean. The heat pressed down on everything, turning the main street into a ribbon of dust that hung in the air with every footfall, every wagon wheel, every whispered judgment. It was the kind of heat that made people cruel, or maybe just made visible the cruelty that had always been there, waiting. Lila Hart had known this town her whole life. She'd been born in the house on Maple Street, married Thomas Hart in the white church on the hill, buried him in the cemetery that overlooked the valley. She'd walked these streets as a child, as a bride, as a widow. But she had never walked them like this, belly swollen with a child the town had decided wasn't respectable, her late husband's name no longer protection enough, the whispers following her like flies. She didn't know when exactly the town had turned against her. Maybe it was when Thomas died from the fever, leaving her alone with 2 children and debts she couldn't pay. Maybe it was when she took in sewing work, then laundry work, then any work at all to keep bread on the table. Maybe it was when Jacob Miller, the railroad surveyor, started visiting her house with promises written on paper she couldn't quite understand, contracts she signed with fingers stiff from washing clothes in cold water. Or maybe it was simply because she was a woman alone, and that was crime enough. The pregnancy had been a mistake, not the child, never the child, but the circumstances. A moment of loneliness with a man who'd seemed kind, who'd promised to stay, who'd disappeared the moment she told him about the baby. The town had watched her belly grow with the same attention they gave to storm clouds on the horizon, waiting to see what damage would come, eager for the spectacle. Maggie understood more than a 7-year-old should. Lila saw it in the way her daughter held herself now, shoulders tight, eyes watchful, always positioning herself between her mother and the world. Ben was only 4, still young enough to smile, but even he'd learned to hold his sister's hand when they walked past groups of women who turned their backs. The contractions had started that morning, earlier than they should have. Lila had tried to ignore them, tried to finish the dress she was mending for Mrs. Patterson, payment due on delivery, but by noon the pain was too sharp to hide. She'd walked to town because she needed the doctor, because she needed help, because somewhere in her heart she still believed that people were fundamentally decent. She'd been wrong. Morton's General Store sat at the center of town, a broad building with a covered porch where men gathered to smoke and talk. Lila had made it that far before her water broke, before the contraction hit so hard she stumbled, before her knees found the dirt and refused to let her stand again. "Mama!" Maggie's voice was high and thin with fear. "I'm all right, sweetheart." The lie tasted like copper. Blood, she realized. She was bleeding too much. "Go find Dr. Harrison. Tell him—" "Dr. Harrison's right there, Lila." Martha Conroy's voice drifted down from the porch, sweet as poison. "He's just busy." Lila lifted her head. The doctor stood 10 feet away on the boardwalk, black bag in hand, staring at her like she was a problem he'd rather not solve. Around him the crowd was gathering, women in their shopping dresses, men abandoning their checker games, children craning their necks to see. "Please." Lila's voice broke on the word. "Something's wrong. The baby—" "Should have thought about that baby before you spread your legs for a man who wasn't your husband." The voice belonged to Samuel Morton, the store owner, a man who'd sold Thomas Hart his first bag of seed corn, who'd extended credit when times were lean. Now he stood in his doorway with his arms crossed, blocking entry like she was vermin. A fresh contraction seized her, and Lila bent forward, gasping. Maggie dropped to her knees beside her mother, small hands hovering uselessly. Ben started crying, the sound piercing the hot afternoon air. "This is indecent." Mrs. Patterson, the woman whose dress Lila had been mending, pulled her own daughter away from the spectacle. "Someone take those children inside before they see—" "See what?" Sheriff Dawson's voice rumbled from somewhere behind the crowd. "Their mother getting what she deserves?" The crowd parted to let him through. He was a big man, soft around the middle from too many years behind a desk, mustache stained yellow from tobacco. He'd been Thomas's friend once, had stood as groomsman at their wedding. Now he looked at Lila the way he'd look at a drunk sleeping it off in a cell. "Sheriff, please." Lila could barely form words around the pain. "My children." "Your children are learning a valuable lesson about consequences." He settled his weight against a porch post, making it clear he had no intention of moving. "Maybe you should have considered them before you disgraced your husband's memory." "Thomas is dead." The words tore out of her, sharp and desperate. "He's been dead for 2 years. I tried. I worked. I did everything." "You sold your land to the railroad for pennies." This from Marcus Webb, the banker, his tone almost conversational. "Signed away your husband's legacy without even reading the contracts." "I needed money for food, for my children." "You needed money because you couldn't keep your skirts down." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was there, cruel little chuckles that rippled through the crowd like wind through dead grass. Lila felt something inside her crack, some last wall of dignity crumbling into dust. Another contraction, harder than before. She screamed, couldn't help it, the sound animal and raw. Blood pooled beneath her now, dark against the pale dirt. This was wrong, all wrong, too much blood too fast. "Mama's bleeding!" Maggie's voice climbed toward hysteria. "Dr. Harrison, please, she's bleeding!" The doctor took a step back, actually stepped back, increasing the distance between himself and the woman dying in the street. "I don't treat whores," he said calmly, "and I don't deliver bastards." The words hung in the air like smoke. Lila heard them through the roaring in her ears, felt them land like stones. Around her the circle tightened, not to help, but to see, to witness, to judge. This was how she would die, she realized, with sudden, terrible clarity. Not in a bed with her children beside her, not with dignity or peace, but here in the dirt outside a store where she'd bought penny candy as a child, surrounded by people who'd once called themselves her neighbors. And her children would watch it happen, would carry that memory forever, would learn that the world was cruel and mercy was a lie. Ben was sobbing now, his small body shaking. Maggie held him, trying to be brave, but tears streaked her face too. "My babies," Lila thought, and reached for them with blood-stained hands. The crowd shifted, someone muttering about the sheriff doing something, but Dawson didn't move. Nobody moved. The sun beat down, merciless. A fly landed on Lila's arm, and she didn't have the strength to brush it away. Then the circle broke. Not from the inside, from the outside. A man pushed through, not roughly, but with the kind of steady insistence that made people step aside without quite knowing why. Lila saw boots first, then legs in worn denim, then a whole man unfolding into the space that had been reserved for her suffering. He was tall, lean, in the way of men who work hard and eat light. His face was weathered, lines carved deep around eyes that were startlingly clear, gray or blue, she couldn't tell in the harsh light. Dust covered him like a second skin, and he carried himself with the careful stillness of someone who'd learned not to make sudden moves. He looked down at Lila, taking in the blood, the position of her body, the terror on her children's faces. Then he looked at the crowd, slow and deliberate, meeting eyes until people looked away. "Nobody's dying today," he said again, and this time it wasn't a statement, but a decision, final as a judge's gavel. He turned to the doctor. "You. Get your bag. Do your job." Dr. Harrison drew himself up. "Now see here. Your oath was to treat people." The stranger's voice didn't rise, but something in it made the doctor's protest die. "That woman's dying. That child's in distress. You want to stand there and tell me your conscience is worth more than their lives? My reputation will survive treating a pregnant woman. Mine won't survive watching one die when I could have stopped it." He moved toward Harrison, not threatening, but inexorable. Your bag. Now." The doctor looked to the sheriff, but Dawson had gone still, hand resting on his gun belt in a way that wasn't quite casual. Whatever he saw in the stranger's face made him keep that hand very still. "I don't take orders from drifters," Harrison tried. "Then take them from your conscience, or from the law. Pretty sure letting someone die when you can help is called negligent homicide." The stranger glanced at Dawson. "That right, Sheriff?" Dawson's jaw worked. "Might could be interpreted that way." "There you go. Law says help her." The stranger turned back to Harrison. "So help her, or admit you're the kind of man who'd rather protect his pride than save a life. Let these good people know exactly what kind of doctor they've got." The silence that followed had weight to it. Harrison's face went red, then white, then red again. Finally, he jerked his head in a nod and moved toward Lila, each step reluctant. "I need hot water," the doctor muttered. "Clean sheets, space to work." "You heard him." The stranger's eyes swept the crowd. "Someone get water boiling. Someone else bring sheets. Everyone else, back up or get out. This woman deserves privacy she should have had from the start." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Martha Conroy's daughter, a girl barely older than Maggie, stepped forward. "I'll get water." "I have sheets." This from an older woman Lila didn't recognize, her face creased with shame. "I'll fetch them." The crowd began to fracture, some people drifting away, others moving with purpose toward tasks. The stranger knelt beside Lila, his movements careful, telegraphed so they wouldn't startle. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm going to pick you up and carry you somewhere dry. That all right with you?" Lila tried to answer, but another contraction hit, stealing her breath. She nodded instead, teeth gritted against a scream. "Maggie," the stranger's voice gentled when he addressed her daughter. "That's your name, right? I heard your mama call you that." Maggie nodded, wide-eyed. "I'm Caleb. I'm going to carry your mama over to the porch where it's shaded, and the doctor's going to help her. But I need you to do something real important. Can you be brave for me?" "I'm trying to be brave." Maggie's voice wavered. "You're doing fine. Better than fine. Now I need you to take Ben's hand and walk right beside me. Your mama's going to want to see you, want to know you're close. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." "Good girl." Caleb slid his arms under Lila, one beneath her knees, one behind her shoulders, and lifted her like she weighed nothing at all. She gasped at the movement, pain lancing through her, but then his arms steadied and she was being carried, cradled against a chest that smelled of leather and sage and something indefinably clean. He walked through the parted crowd with measured steps, Maggie and Ben trailing behind, their small hands clasped tight. When he reached the porch, he lowered Lila onto a nest of blankets someone had hastily arranged, then stepped back to give the doctor room. "Doctor." Harrison worked in tight-lipped silence, his hands efficient even if his manner was cold. Caleb stood nearby, not hovering but present, his shadow falling across Lila like a shield. When she screamed, couldn't help it, the pain was too much. He didn't flinch or look away. He simply stayed. The birth was hard and bloody and terrifying. There were moments when Lila was certain she would die, moments when the doctor's face went grim and she knew he was certain too. But Caleb's shadow remained, solid and unwavering, and Maggie's voice floated to her through the fog of pain. "Mama's strong, Ben. Mama's so strong." And somehow that was enough to keep fighting. When the baby finally came, she didn't cry at first. The silence stretched long enough for Lila's heart to stop, long enough for her to understand that some endings were inevitable after all. Then the doctor did something, rubbed the tiny chest, cleared the airway, and a thin wail pierced the air. "A girl," Harrison said flatly. "Small, but breathing." Lila started crying then, great shaking sobs of relief and exhaustion. Someone, the older woman who'd brought sheets, placed the baby on her chest, and Lila wrapped trembling arms around the smallest, most perfect thing she'd ever held. "She's beautiful," Maggie whispered, kneeling beside her mother. "Mama, she's so beautiful." "She is," Lila managed. "She really is." She looked up, searching for the stranger, for Caleb, but he'd moved to the edge of the porch, giving them space. He stood with his back to them, shoulders rigid, staring out at nothing. Dr. Harrison finished his work in silence, packing his instruments with sharp, precise movements. When he was done, He stood without meeting Lila's eyes. You'll need rest, lots of fluids. Watch for fever. His tone was clinical, professional, empty of warmth. The bleeding should slow now, but if it doesn't... He paused, seemed to struggle with something, then continued. If it doesn't, send for me. It was the closest thing to kindness he could offer, and they both knew it. He left without another word. The crowd had mostly dispersed, embarrassed or disappointed, or both. Only a few people remained, the older woman with the sheets, Martha's daughter, a couple of men who looked deeply uncomfortable but hadn't quite managed to walk away. Lila's body ached everywhere, pain layered on pain, but the baby was breathing and warm against her chest, and that was enough. It had to be enough. Ma'am? Caleb's voice came from above, and she realized he'd turned back, was looking down at her with something complicated in his face. You got somewhere to go? Someone who can help you? The question was gentle, but it hit like a fist. Somewhere to go. Someone to help. The answer to both was no. No home big enough, no family close enough, no friends brave enough to associate with her now. The house on Maple Street had been sold to pay debts. The railroad owned her land. She had nothing but 2 children, a newborn baby, and the clothes on her back. I'll figure something out, she heard herself say, the lie automatic. Caleb's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he heard what she wasn't saying. He glanced at Maggie and Ben, both pressed close to their mother, then at the baby dozing against Lila's chest. I bought a place, he said slowly. Ranch about 3 miles out, at the base of the hills. Previous owner left quick, place is half fixed at best, but the roof don't leak and there's room. He paused, seemed to choose his words carefully. You're welcome to it, while you recover, until you figure out what comes next. Lila stared at him. I don't even know you. No, ma'am, but I know what it looks like when someone needs help, and I know what it looks like when a whole town decides someone doesn't deserve it. His jaw tightened. Offer stands, no expectations, no strings, just a roof and some time to heal. Why? The word came out broken. Why would you do that? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, fixed on something only he could see. When he spoke, his voice was low, edged with old pain. Because someone should have stepped up before today, he said simply, and nobody did. The ride out to Caleb's ranch was slow and careful, Lila cradled in the back of a borrowed wagon cushioned with every spare blanket the older woman, Mrs. Yates, she'd finally introduced herself, could find. Maggie and Ben sat on either side of their mother, silent and solemn, while the baby slept with the oblivious peace of the newly born. Caleb drove without speaking, his attention on the rutted road. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was heavy with unasked questions. Who was this man? Where had he come from? What kind of stranger walked into a town and upended everything without breaking stride? The ranch appeared as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, golden light spilling across weathered buildings that had seen better days. The main house was small but solid, built from logs that had grayed with age. A barn leaned slightly to one side, and a corral fence needed mending in at least 3 places. But there was water, a creek running clear and cold from the hills, and land that rolled green toward the mountains. It's not much, Caleb said, the first words he'd spoken since they left town. But it's honest work bringing it back. He helped Lila down with the same careful strength he'd shown before, then carried her inside while Maggie and Ben followed like shadows. The interior was sparse. A main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, 2 small bedrooms branching off to the sides. Everything was clean but bare, like someone had swept away the past and hadn't yet decided on a future. Caleb settled Lila in the larger bedroom, onto a bed that was narrow but sturdy, covered with quilts that smelled of cedar and sunlight. He brought water in a chipped basin, set it on the bedside table, then stepped back. I'll be in the barn, he said. You need anything? Send one of the kids. I'll hear them. Mr. Rourke, Lila started. Caleb's fine. Caleb, she adjusted the baby in her arms, trying to find words adequate for what he'd done. Thank you. I don't know how to... I can't... Don't need thanks, he interrupted quietly. Just need you to rest. You've been through hell today. Let your body catch up. He left before she could respond, his boots echoing across the wooden floor, the door closing with a soft click. Maggie climbed onto the bed beside her mother, careful not to jostle the baby. "Mama, is he a good man?" It was the kind of question only children asked, the kind that demanded honesty. Lila thought about the way Caleb had stepped into that circle, the steadiness in his voice when he'd told the doctor to do his job, the gentleness with which he'd addressed Maggie by name. "I think so, sweetheart," she said softly. "I think he might be." Ben curled up at the foot of the bed, thumb in his mouth, exhaustion claiming him fast. Within minutes he was asleep, his small chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the innocent. Maggie lasted longer, her eyes fighting to stay open, until finally she too surrendered. Lila lay awake, the baby warm against her chest, and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into evening. Somewhere outside, a horse whinnied. The creek murmured its endless conversation with the stones. And in the barn, she heard the quiet sounds of work, wood being moved, metal scraping metal, the normal noises of a man putting his world in order. She tried to make sense of the day, to understand how she'd gone from dying in the dirt to lying in a stranger's bed with her children safe beside her. It didn't make sense, couldn't make sense, and yet here she was, alive, all of them alive. The baby stirred, made a small sound, then settled again. Lila pressed her lips to the soft crown of her daughter's head, breathing in that new baby smell that was like nothing else in the world. "Thank you," she whispered to the room, to the silence, to whatever force of fortune or fate had sent Caleb Rourke walking past that store at exactly the moment she needed him most. Outside, night fell soft and complete, stars emerging one by one across the Wyoming sky. And in the barn, a man who'd spent years running from his past worked alone in the darkness, trying not to think about the woman and children sleeping in his house, trying not to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he'd finally found something worth staying for. The first 3 days passed in a haze of exhaustion and healing. Lila slept more than she'd slept in years, her body demanding rest the way parched ground demands rain. When she woke, it was to find water beside the bed, fresh and cold, bread wrapped in cloth, sometimes eggs, still warm. Caleb never brought these things himself. He left them outside the door, knocked once, and disappeared before she could thank him. Maggie appointed herself nursemaid and took the role seriously. She brought her mother water when asked, held the baby while Lila used the chamber pot, and kept Ben quiet with whispered stories and games played in corners. The girl was 7 years old and already understood that survival sometimes meant making yourself small, making yourself useful, making yourself indispensable so the world couldn't throw you away. It broke Lila's heart to see it. On the 4th morning, Lila woke to find herself alone in the room. Panic seized her immediately. Where were the children? Where was the baby? But then she heard voices outside, young and bright, and the panic settled into something closer to confusion. She rose slowly, testing her body's willingness to cooperate. Everything ached, but it was the normal ache of healing rather than the sharp agony of crisis. The bleeding had slowed to something manageable. Her breasts were heavy with milk, and the baby, she really needed to choose a name, had nursed well through the night. Lila wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and moved to the window. In the yard, Maggie and Ben stood beside the corral fence, watching Caleb work with a horse. He moved with the patient certainty of someone who'd spent a lifetime around animals, his voice too low to hear, but his hands visible, steady on the horse's neck. Ben was asking questions. She could tell by the way he bounced on his toes between words. And Caleb was answering, gesturing toward the horse's legs, its ears, explaining something that made Maggie nod thoughtfully. The scene was so normal, so domestic, that Lila felt something twist in her chest. This wasn't their life. This was borrowed time in a borrowed place, charity from a stranger who'd already given more than anyone had a right to expect. Sooner or later, she'd have to figure out what came next, where they'd go, how they'd survive. But not today. Today, her children were safe and fed and learning about horses from a man who didn't seem to mind their questions. Today was enough. She was about to turn away when Caleb looked up, his gaze finding the window as if he'd known she was there all along. Their eyes met across the distance. He didn't smile. She was learning he rarely did. But he nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, then returned his attention to the horse and the children. Lila moved away from the window, suddenly aware of how she must look. Unwashed, wearing a borrowed nightdress, hair tangled from days in bed. She found a pitcher of water on the kitchen table, still faintly warm, and a sliver of soap beside it. Someone had thought of everything. She washed as best she could, finger-combed her hair into something resembling order, then checked on the baby. Still sleeping, tiny fists curled beside her face, expression peaceful in that way that only the very young could manage. Lila studied her daughter's features, looking for traces of the father, and finding none, grateful for the absence. "You need a name," she murmured. "Can't keep calling you the baby forever." But nothing felt right yet. Names carried weight, carried meaning, and this child had been born into circumstances that defied simple labels. Lila wanted something that spoke to survival, to the future, to the impossible fact that they were all still breathing. The door opened and Maggie burst in, cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mama, you're up! Caleb said we had to be quiet so you could rest, but I told him you always wake up early, and he said—" She stopped, suddenly uncertain. "Are you supposed to be out of bed?" "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just needed to move a little." Lila smiled, trying to project a confidence she didn't quite feel. "What were you doing outside?" "Learning about horses," Ben announced, following his sister inside. "Caleb says I can help brush them when I'm bigger. He says horses know when you're nervous, so you have to be brave and calm, and he searched for the word. "Steady," Maggie supplied. "He says you have to be steady." "That sounds like good advice." Lila glanced past her children, but Caleb hadn't followed them in. "Where is he now?" "Fixing the fence." Maggie moved to the baby's cradle, peering down with fierce protectiveness. "He said it wouldn't hold if a storm came, so he's making it stronger. Can I hold her?" "Gently. Support her head." Lila watched as Maggie lifted her sister with exaggerated care, settling into the rocking chair with the baby cradled against her chest. The girl looked so young and so old at the same time, childhood and responsibility warring in her face. "We need to name her," Maggie said softly. "It's been 4 days. That's long enough, isn't it?" "What do you think we should call her?" Maggie considered this seriously, rocking slowly. "Something strong. Something that means she's going to be okay." "Hope," Ben offered suddenly, "like when you hope for something good." The words settled into the room like a living thing. Hope. It was simple, almost painfully so, but it carried exactly the weight Lila had been searching for. This child, born in the dirt and blood and cruelty, who had every reason not to survive, and yet here she was, breathing, nursing, growing stronger by the hour. Hope wasn't just a name, it was a statement of intent. "Hope," Lila repeated, testing it. "Hope, heart." Maggie smiled, the expression transforming her serious face into something lighter. "I like it. It's perfect." "Then hope it is." Lila crossed to her daughters, pressed a kiss to Maggie's head, then to Hope's. "You hear that, baby girl? You've got a name now. You're Hope, and you're going to live up to it." The baby made a small sound. Whether in agreement or protest, it was impossible to say, and Lila laughed, actually laughed, for the first time since before Thomas died. The sound brought Caleb to the door. He stood on the threshold, not quite entering, a hammer in one hand and wariness in his eyes, like maybe laughter was something he'd forgotten the sound of. "Everything all right?" His gaze swept the room, checking, always checking. "We named the baby," Ben announced proudly. "Her name is Hope." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, too quick to name but real enough to see. "Hope," he repeated quietly. "That's a good name. A strong name." "Ben chose it," Lila said, and watched her son's chest puff with pride. Caleb nodded, acknowledging the boy's contribution with the seriousness it deserved. Then he turned to Lila, and his voice gentled the way it did when he was trying not to spook something fragile. "You should be resting. Doctor said at least a week before you're up and moving around." "I've rested plenty, and I can't stay in bed forever." She squared her shoulders, trying to project strength she was still rebuilding. "I need to start figuring out what comes next. I can't impose on your kindness indefinitely." Ain't imposing if I offered. Caleb shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the gratitude he could hear building in her voice. And there's no rush. Take the time you need. I don't have time. I have 3 children and no money, and Lila stopped, aware of young ears listening. I need to make a plan. Plans can wait until you're healed. His tone left no room for argument. You push yourself too hard now, you'll end up sick or worse, and then where will your kids be? It was a fair point, delivered without judgment, and Lila found she had no counter for it. She sagged slightly, exhaustion creeping back in despite the brief surge of energy. Caleb saw it, saw everything with those 2 clear eyes. There's stew on the stove. Made it this morning. You should eat, then rest some more. Kids can help me with the fence if they want. Give you some quiet. I want to help. Ben was already moving toward the door. Me too, Maggie added, though she glanced at her mother first, seeking permission. Lila nodded, too tired to protest. Stay where Caleb can see you, and listen to what he says. Yes, Mama. They fled outside with the enthusiasm of children freed from sickroom duty, leaving Lila alone with hope and a silence that felt heavier than it should. She fed the baby, ate the stew, rich with venison and vegetables, better than anything she'd managed to make in months, then surrendered to her body's demands and went back to bed. Outside, the sound of hammering resumed, steady and sure, the rhythm of a man building something meant to last. The days developed a pattern after that. Mornings, Lila would wake to find Caleb already gone, out checking the property, tending the horses, working on one of the dozen repairs the ranch needed. Maggie and Ben would eat breakfast, then slip outside to shadow him, drawn by his quiet competence and the way he answered their questions without condescension. Afternoons, Lila rested while the children napped, and Hope nursed and slept with the single-minded focus of the newborn. Evenings, they all gathered around the table for dinner. Simple food, but there was always enough. And Caleb would retreat to the barn while Lila put the children to bed. They existed in the same space but occupied separate orbits, careful not to collide, both aware of the strangeness of their arrangement. It was on the 8th day that everything shifted. Lila was sitting in the rocking chair, nursing Hope, and watching Maggie teach Ben his letters on the slate she'd salvaged from their old house, when she heard voices outside. Not the children, they were right here. Not Caleb working alone. Actual conversation, multiple people, tones carrying tension. She pulled Hope away, hastily adjusted her dress, and moved to the window. 3 men on horseback had stopped in the yard, and Caleb stood facing them with the kind of stillness that preceded violence. Lila recognized one of the riders immediately, Marcus Webb, the banker from town, his expensive suit dusty from the ride. The other 2 were strangers, but they had the look of men paid to intimidate. Stay inside, Lila told Maggie sharply. Watch your brother and the baby. Don't come out no matter what you hear. Mama? I mean it, Maggie. She stepped outside before she could think better of it, her legs still shaky but holding. The men's attention swung to her immediately, Webb's expression curdling into something ugly. Mrs. Hart, he said her name like an accusation. I'd heard you were, recovering here. What do you want, Mr. Webb? Lila kept her voice level, refusing to show the fear climbing her spine. I want what I'm owed. You signed papers, Mrs. Hart? Legal documents selling your land to the railroad. But there seems to be some confusion about the boundaries, and now the railroad is claiming they got less acreage than promised. I don't understand. I sold you everything. You sold us what you told us you owned. Turns out the surveyor's measurements were off, way off. Webb's smile was sharp as broken glass. Which means you committed fraud, Mrs. Hart. Sold property you didn't have clear title to. Caleb spoke for the first time, his voice low and dangerous. You're saying she made a mistake on paperwork she couldn't read? That a surveyor you hired got wrong, and somehow that's fraud? I'm saying she owes the bank money, significant money. Webb pulled a document from his jacket. Unless she can provide proof of the original boundaries, which we both know she can't, she's in default of the loan we extended against the property value. Lila's mind reeled. What loan? I never took a loan, the advance against the sale, which you spent. Webb's tone was patient, explanatory, the voice of a man explaining simple concepts to a slow child. Now the sale is invalid, the money is owed, and you have no means to repay it. How convenient, Caleb said softly, that you discovered this mistake now, after she's got nothing left, after she's desperate. The timing is unfortunate, Webb agreed, not bothering to sound sincere. But business is business. Mrs. Hart has 30 days to repay the full amount, $240, or face legal consequences. $240. It might as well have been $2,000 or $2 million. Lila had maybe $3 to her name, and that was counting the coins in the jar she'd buried before leaving town. She can't pay that. Caleb's words were flat, factual. Then she'll go to jail for fraud and theft, and her children will go to the orphanage in Cheyenne. Unless, Webb paused, letting the word hang, unless she's willing to negotiate alternative arrangements. The implication was clear, ugly, made worse by the way Webb's eyes traveled over Lila's body. She felt Caleb go rigid beside her, felt violence gathering in him like a storm. Get off my property. Caleb's voice was so quiet Lila barely heard it, but the men on horseback heard it fine. They shifted, hands moving toward weapons. Your property? Webb's eyebrows rose. I wasn't aware you had a claim here, Mr. Rourke. This ranch isn't registered to you in any legal capacity. You're just another drifter squatting on land you don't own. The deed's being processed, filed with the territory office 2 weeks ago. You can check the records if you know how to read. Caleb took a step forward, and somehow that single step made him seem larger, more dangerous. But that's not really what this is about, is it? This is about you trying to leverage a woman who's already down, trying to force her into something she'd never choose if she had options. I'm offering her a solution. You're offering her slavery with a different name, and we both know it. Another step. Now I told you once to get off my property. I won't tell you again. One of Webb's men put his hand on his gun. That sounded like a threat. It's a fact. You're trespassing. I'm within my rights to defend my land. Caleb's hand didn't move toward his own weapon. Didn't need to. Something in his posture, in the absolute certainty of his stance, made it clear he knew exactly how this would end if it came to violence. Webb studied Caleb for a long moment, calculation moving behind his eyes. Whatever he saw made him pull his horse's reins, turning the animal's head toward the road. 30 days, Mrs. Hart. That's all you've got. After that, the law comes for you and yours. He tipped his hat in a mockery of politeness. Enjoy your recovery. They rode out slow, taking their time, making sure the message landed. Lila watched them go, her hands shaking so badly she had to clasp them together to hide it. When they were finally out of sight, Caleb turned to her. You all right? All right? The word came out sharp, edged with hysteria she couldn't quite contain. They're going to take my children. They're going to... She couldn't finish the sentence. No, they're not. Caleb's certainty was absolute. I won't let that happen. You can't stop it. You heard him. I signed papers. I took money. And now they're saying I owe... Lila pressed her hands to her face, fighting for control. I was so stupid, so desperate and stupid, and now... Hey! Caleb's hand touched her shoulder, gentle but grounding. You weren't stupid. You were a widow with kids to feed and predators who saw an opportunity. That's not the same thing. It doesn't matter what it was. What matters is they're coming for us, and I don't have... Lila. He waited until she looked at him. Breathe. Just breathe for a minute. She tried, drawing air into lungs that didn't want to expand, forcing herself to think past the panic. What am I going to do? Caleb was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. Those papers you signed, you still have them? I don't know, maybe? They gave me copies, but I don't know where they ended up. Everything happened so fast after Thomas died, and I was trying to keep up with the rent, and if you have them, I might be able to find someone to look at them. Someone who knows the law, who can tell us if Webb's claim holds water. He paused. Because I'm betting it doesn't. I'm betting this is all smoke and threats designed to make you fold before you can fight back. Even if you're right, I don't have money for a lawyer. Didn't say anything about money. I said someone who knows the law. Caleb's jaw tightened. I might know someone. Someone who owes me. There was a story there, buried in those words, but Lila was too exhausted to excavate it. And if it turns out the claim is real, if I really do owe that money, then we figure out a different solution. He said it like it was simple, like problems always had solutions if you looked hard enough. We, Lila repeated softly. Why do you keep saying we? This isn't your problem. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving through his expression. Maybe I'm tired of walking away from problems. Maybe I'm tired of letting bad things happen because it's easier than getting involved. His voice dropped. Or maybe I just don't like bullies. Before Lila could respond, the door burst open and Maggie flew out, Ben right behind her. Mama, is everything okay? Those men looked mean and we heard shouting. Everything's fine, sweetheart. Lila pulled her children close, holding them tight. Over their heads, she met Caleb's eyes. We're going to figure this out. He nodded once, then turned toward the barn. I'll ride into town tomorrow, see what I can learn. Caleb, she waited until he looked back. Thank you for all of it. He didn't answer, just touched the brim of his hat and walked away, his shadow long in the afternoon sun. That night, after the children were asleep, Lila sat at the kitchen table with every paper she'd managed to salvage from her old life spread before her. Most of it was useless, receipts for purchases she could barely remember, letters from Thomas's mother back east, a deed to property that no longer belonged to her. But buried in the pile, she found what she was looking for. The contract she'd signed with the railroad, witnessed by Marcus Webb himself. She couldn't make sense of the legal language. It might as well have been written in a foreign tongue, but she could see the numbers. $240 advanced against the purchase of 120 acres at $2 per acre, except the survey had shown only 80 acres, which meant she'd been overpaid by $80, which meant, according to Webb's logic, she owed the difference, plus interest plus penalties, that somehow added up to the full amount. It was circular reasoning, predatory mathematics, and she had no idea how to fight it. A knock on the door made her jump. She wasn't expecting anyone. Caleb always announced himself, and no one else knew where she was. She opened the door to find him standing there, hat in hand, expression unreadable in the lamplight. Saw your light still burning, he said quietly. Figured you might be worrying yourself sick over those papers. I don't understand any of it. Lila stepped back, letting him inside. It's all legal terms and numbers that don't add up, and I don't know how to make sense of it. Caleb moved to the table, studying the documents with an intensity that suggested he understood more than she'd expected. This clause here, he tapped one section, says any disputes about acreage are to be resolved by independent survey. Did they do that? I don't know. They just told me there was a problem and I owed money. Because they're hoping you won't know to ask questions. He straightened, rolling the papers carefully. I'm taking these to someone tomorrow, someone who will give us straight answers. Who? Caleb hesitated, something guarded moving across his face. A judge I used to know. He's retired now, lives in Larkspur, about half a day's ride. He's honest, which is more than I can say for most. Used to know, Lila repeated. As in before you came here? Before you... She trailed off, realizing she'd never actually asked where he'd come from or why. Before a lot of things. Caleb's voice went flat. I wasn't always a ranch hand, Mrs. Hart. Had a different life, made different choices. Some of them good, some of them... He stopped, jaw working. Some of them I'm still paying for. The admission hung between them, heavy with unspoken history. Lila thought about the way he'd handled Webb's men, the way he moved with the certainty of someone who'd faced down worse. The way he sometimes woke in the night, she'd heard him pacing the barn, footsteps restless with ghosts she couldn't see. Whatever you were before, she said carefully, you're a good man now. That's what matters. Caleb's laugh was bitter, humorless. Good men don't run from their past. Good men don't... He caught himself, shook his head. Doesn't matter. What matters is getting you out from under Webb's thumb. It does matter. To me. To my children. Lila moved closer, close enough to see the lines around his eyes, the weight he carried in the set of his shoulders. You saved our lives. You gave us shelter when we had nothing. You're helping us fight battles that aren't yours to fight. That makes you good, Caleb. Whatever came before doesn't change that. He looked at her then, really looked, and something in his expression cracked open just enough for her to glimpse the man beneath the armor. You don't know what came before. Then tell me. The words were out before she could stop them, hanging in the air between confession and command. Caleb went very still, the kind of stillness that came before a decision that couldn't be unmade. I was a lawman, he said finally, voice low and rough. Deputy U.S. Marshal, working out of Denver. Good at it too, or thought I was. Tracked fugitives, brought them in, believed I was serving justice. He paused, the muscle in his jaw jumping. Then, 3 years ago, I made a mistake. A bad one. Lila waited, not pushing, letting him find his way through the story. There was a man, Silas Crane, wanted for murder, robbery, 6 other charges. I tracked him to a mining camp outside Boulder. He was holed up in a shack with another man, and when I kicked in the door, Caleb's hands flexed, remembering. I saw movement, saw a gun, and I fired. Killed the other man instantly. Perfect shot, right through the heart. But it wasn't Crane, Lila said softly. No, it was a prospector named Daniel Marsh, 42 years old, father of 3. His only crime was being in the wrong place when a scared lawman came through the door. Caleb's voice cracked. Crane got away in the confusion, used Marsh as cover and vanished. I killed an innocent man and let a murderer escape. Perfect record. The weight of it settled over them both, the guilt, the grief, the impossible mathematics of justice and failure. What happened after? Lila asked. Investigation. Cleared of wrongdoing, legally anyway. They said I followed protocol, said it was a clean shoot given the circumstances. Offered me a commendation. His smile was sharp enough to draw blood. I turned it in my badge instead. Couldn't stomach the idea of wearing it, knowing what I'd done. Been drifting ever since, picking up work where I could find it, trying to outrun the memory of Marsh's face when he fell. And Crane? Still out there, far as I know. Still free? Still breathing. Caleb turned away, unable to hold her gaze. So you see, Mrs. Hart, I'm not the man you think I am. I'm just someone who made a choice that can't be unmade, trying to live with consequences that don't have an ending. Lila absorbed this, turning it over in her mind. She thought about the man who'd stepped into that circle in town, who'd stood between her and a crowd's cruelty without hesitation. She thought about the way he was with her children, patient and kind and careful to make them feel safe. You made a mistake, she said finally. A terrible mistake that cost a good man his life. And you've been punishing yourself for it ever since. It's not punishment if it's deserved. Isn't it? Lila moved around the table until she stood in front of him, forcing him to look at her. You gave up everything, your career, your life, probably people you cared about. You've been running and hiding and trying to make yourself small enough to disappear. That sounds like punishment to me. It's not enough. The words were raw, scraped from somewhere deep. Nothing I do will bring Daniel Marsh back. Nothing will give his children their father or his wife her husband. I can't fix it, so the least I can do is remember it, carry it, not let myself forget what I took. You're right, Lila said quietly. You can't fix it, but you can choose what you do with what's left. You can keep running and let that one moment define everything you are. Or, she paused, choosing her words carefully. Or you can do what you've been doing. Step up when someone needs help. Stand between people and the cruelty they don't deserve. Be the man who saves lives instead of the man who took one. Caleb stared at her, something fierce and fragile warring in his expression. It's not that simple. It never is. Lila thought about the judgment in that crowd's eyes, the way they'd been ready to let her die rather than soil themselves with charity. But we don't get to choose whether we made mistakes, Caleb. We only get to choose what we do after. And you, her voice strengthened, you chose to help us. That matters. It doesn't erase what happened, but it matters. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Caleb nodded once, sharp and final, like accepting a verdict he'd been avoiding. I'll leave at first light, he said. Should be back before dark tomorrow. You'll be all right here? We'll manage. He moved toward the door, then paused on the threshold. Lila, that's the first time I've told anyone that story. About Marsh. About what I did. Oh, thank you for trusting me with it. Thank you for not... He stopped, shook his head. For not looking at me different. I see you exactly the same, Lila said truthfully. Maybe even clearer than before. Caleb left without another word, and Lila stood in the doorway watching him cross to the barn, his shadow swallowed by the darkness. She thought about guilt and redemption, about the ways people carried their mistakes and the ways they tried to atone. She thought about a man who'd killed someone by accident and a town that had tried to kill her on purpose, and which one had shown her more kindness. Then she closed the door, checked on her sleeping children one more time, and went to bed with the certain knowledge that whatever happened next, they wouldn't face it alone. Caleb rode out before dawn, the papers tucked inside his jacket, and Lila spent the day in a state of suspended waiting. She tried to keep busy, washing clothes in the creek, mending a tear in Ben's shirt, nursing hope and watching her daughter's face for signs of the colic that sometimes struck newborns. But her mind kept circling back to those documents, to Webb's threats, to the 30 days ticking away like a countdown to disaster. Maggie noticed the way she noticed everything. Caleb will fix it, she said with the absolute certainty of childhood. He fixes everything. Lila wished she could share that faith, but she'd learned the hard way that some things stayed broken no matter how hard you tried to mend them. The sun was dropping toward the western peaks when she heard hoofbeats. She stepped outside, hope in her arms, and watched Caleb ride in. One look at his face told her the news wasn't simple. He dismounted slowly, moving like a man who'd spent too many hours in the saddle, and pulled the papers from his jacket. Judge Holloway looked at everything. Took him about 20 minutes to spot the problems. Problems plural? Lila's heart sank. The contract's a mess, full of clauses that contradict each other, penalty terms that aren't legal in the territory, and measurements that don't match the official survey filed with the land office. Caleb's expression was grim. Webb was counting on you not knowing how to read it, not having anyone to explain it to you. It's fraud, Lila, clear as day. Relief and confusion warred in her chest. So I don't owe the money? You don't owe anything. The contract's invalid, the survey was falsified, and the money they gave you was an illegal advance on a sale they had no right to make. He paused. But here's the problem. Proving it means going up against Webb and the railroad in court. Means filing complaints, getting lawyers involved, probably making some powerful people very angry. I don't care about making them angry. I care about keeping my children safe. I know, but there's something else. Caleb's jaw tightened. Holloway recognized my name, asked questions I couldn't dodge. He knows about Marsh, knows I left the Marshal Service under a cloud. He was understanding, but he made it clear that if this goes to court, my past will come up. Webb's lawyers will use it to discredit anything I say on your behalf. Lila absorbed this, understanding the weight he was carrying. So what do we do? We fight anyway. Holloway said he'd testify if needed, and he's got enough standing in the territory that his word carries weight. We file the complaint, force an investigation, and hope the evidence speaks loud enough that my history doesn't matter. Caleb looked at her steadily. But you need to know. This could get ugly. Webb won't go down quiet, and when cornered, men like that get dangerous. More dangerous than letting them take my children? Lila shifted hope to her shoulder, feeling the baby's warm weight against her neck. I'll take my chances. Then we do it tomorrow. I'll ride back to Larkspur, file the papers with Holloway, and set things in motion. He hesitated. You should think about going to church on Sunday. The suggestion was so unexpected that Lila actually laughed, bitter and sharp. Church? The same church that watched me nearly die in the street? The same people who need to see you're still standing, that you're not ashamed, not hiding, not broken. Caleb's voice was quiet but firm. Webb's been telling his version of events all over town. You need to tell yours, not with words, just by showing up, by looking them in the eye and daring them to judge you again. They will judge me. They'll always judge me. Probably. But some of them will remember that you're a human being, not a cautionary tale. Some of them will feel shame for what they did or didn't do. And that shame, he paused, that shame might turn into something useful when this hits the courts. Lila thought about walking into that church, facing those people, carrying hope in her arms like evidence of her supposed sin. Everything in her recoiled from the idea, wanted to stay hidden on this ranch until the world forgot she existed. But hiding hadn't saved her. Caleb stepping forward had saved her, refusing to disappear, refusing to accept their judgment as truth. That had saved her. "I'll need a dress," she said finally. "Something clean. Something that doesn't look like I'm begging for their approval. Something that looked like she'd won." Sunday morning arrived bright and clear, the kind of day that seemed designed to mock difficult decisions. Lila dressed carefully in the one good dress she'd managed to keep, dark blue cotton, simple but well made, altered to fit her post-pregnancy body. She braided her hair, pinned it up, and studied herself in the small mirror above the wash basin. She looked tired. She looked thin. But she didn't look defeated, and that would have to be enough. Maggie and Ben wore their Sunday clothes, scrubbed and nervous. Hope was wrapped in the christening gown that had been Maggie's, then Ben's, now hers, cream-colored linen with tiny embroidered flowers at the collar. Caleb waited by the wagon, dressed in what passed for his finest. Clean shirt, vest, hat brushed free of dust. He'd shaved, and the absence of stubble made him look younger, less worn, though his eyes still carried shadows that soap and water couldn't touch. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly as she approached. "We can find another way." "There is no other way. You said it yourself, people need to see me. Need to remember I exist." Lila climbed into the wagon, settled Hope in her lap, waited for the children to scramble up beside her. "Let's go remind them." The ride into town was silent, except for the creak of wheels and the steady clip of hooves. As they got closer, Lila felt her resolve wavering, felt the old fear creeping back. What if this made things worse? What if her presence triggered another confrontation, another public humiliation? What if they threw her out again, but this time her children saw it all clearly, understood every cruel word, internalized the lesson that their mother was worthless? "Breathe," Caleb murmured, so quiet only she could hear. "Just breathe and walk through those doors. I'll be right behind you." They reached the church as bells were ringing, calling the faithful to worship. Families streamed toward the white building on the hill, dressed in their best, chatting and laughing like this was any other Sunday. Like 2 weeks ago, they hadn't stood in a circle and watched a woman bleed in the street. Lila stepped down from the wagon, legs unsteady. Caleb appeared at her elbow, not touching but present, a wall between her and the world. Maggie took Ben's hand, both children pressing close. "Together," Lila whispered, and they walked toward the church. The conversations died as people noticed her. Silence spread like spilled water, faces turning, eyes widening. Lila kept her gaze forward, kept walking, one foot in front of the other. She reached the steps, climbed them, pushed open the door. The sanctuary was half full, people settling into pews, hymn books open. Every head turned as she entered. The organist's hands froze mid-chord, the sound cutting off abruptly. In the sudden silence, Lila could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of judgment pressing down from all sides. She walked down the center aisle, chin up, hope held securely against her chest. Behind her, Maggie and Ben followed, their footsteps echoing. Caleb brought up the rear, his presence solid and unwavering. Lila chose a pew halfway up, not hiding in the back, not presuming to sit in front. She settled into the wooden seat, arranged her skirts, positioned Hope so the baby was visible. Maggie and Ben slid in beside her, and Caleb took his place at the end of the row, effectively boxing them in, protecting them from the stairs burning into their backs. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Pastor Reynolds appeared from the vestry, his round face creased with confusion and something that might have been distress. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked helplessly at his congregation. "Well," he said finally, his voice uncertain, Shall we begin?" The service proceeded in fits and starts, everyone too aware of Lila's presence to focus on prayers or hymns. She didn't sing, didn't pray, just sat with her daughter in her arms and refused to shrink. Halfway through the first hymn, she heard movement behind her. Someone standing, gathering their things, leaving. Then another, and another. By the time the hymn ended, 5 families had walked out rather than share the sanctuary with her, but others remained. Mrs. Yates, the woman who'd brought sheets during the birth, sat 3 rows back and met Lila's eyes when she glanced around, not smiling, but nodding. Martha Conroy's daughter, the girl who'd fetched water, was there with her parents, looking uncomfortable but staying put. The sermon, when it came, was about forgiveness. Pastor Reynolds stumbled through it, clearly unprepared for the irony, his words about mercy and judgment and casting stones landing with unintended weight. Lila listened with half an ear, more focused on the rustling behind her, the whispers that weren't quite quiet enough to hide. Then, just as Reynolds was building to his conclusion, the church doors opened. Marcus Webb walked in, flanked by 2 men Lila recognized from his visit to the ranch. He didn't sit, didn't pretend to be there for worship. He simply stood at the back, arms crossed, watching Lila with an expression that promised consequences. Caleb went very still beside her. Lila felt his hand move to his hip, then stop. Remembering perhaps that he'd left his gun in the wagon, that churches weren't places for violence even when violence walked through the door. Pastor Reynolds faltered, losing his thread. Perhaps we should, that is, if there are those among us who've come seeking reconciliation. I've come seeking justice. Webb's voice carried easily through the quiet space. And I believe Mrs. Hart knows exactly what I'm referring to. Every eye swung between them. Lila in her pew, Webb in the doorway, the confrontation everyone had been waiting for finally arriving. Lila stood slowly, hope in her arms, and turned to face him. If you have something to say to me, Mr. Webb, say it plain. Gladly. He pulled papers from his coat, the same theatrical gesture he'd used at the ranch. I filed a complaint with Sheriff Dawson regarding your fraudulent land sale. You have 20 days remaining to make restitution, after which a warrant will be issued for your arrest. That contract was fraud and you know it. Caleb's voice was low, dangerous. You falsified the survey, buried illegal terms in language she couldn't read, and tried to steal her land while pretending to help her. Webb's smile was thin. Bold accusations from a man with no legal standing and a very questionable past. Tell me, Mr. Rourke, does Mrs. Hart know about Daniel Marsh? Does she know the kind of man she's taken shelter with? The name dropped like a stone into still water. Ripples of recognition spread through the congregation. Some had heard the story. Others were hearing it now for the first time. Lila felt Caleb tense beside her, saw his jaw clench, knew he was bracing for the blow. Yes, she said clearly, loudly enough for everyone to hear. I know exactly what happened. I know Caleb Rourke made a terrible mistake that cost an innocent man his life. I know he's carried that guilt every day since, that he gave up everything rather than pretend it didn't matter. She paused, letting her words settle. And I know that when I was dying in the street with my children watching, when every person in this church turned their back, he was the only one who stepped forward. So yes, Mr. Webb, I know who Caleb is. Do you know who you are? The question hung in the air, sharp as a blade. Webb's expression flickered, surprise, then anger, then calculation. I'm a businessman protecting my interests. If that makes me a villain in your eyes, so be it. He turned to address the congregation. Let the record show that Mrs. Hart has aligned herself with a disgraced lawman and refuses to honor her debts. When the sheriff comes for her, let no one claim they weren't warned. He left as dramatically as he'd entered, his men following like shadows. The door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the sanctuary. For a moment, silence reigned. Then Mrs. Yates stood, her voice cutting through the tension. That man is a snake, and everyone here knows it. Been cheating folks for years, hiding behind legal papers and fine words. Maybe it's time someone called him on it. That's easy to say when you're not the one facing jail. This from Samuel Morton, the store owner who'd blocked his door during Lila's labor. Mrs. Hart brought this on herself with loose morals and poor decisions. Poor decisions? Lila's voice cracked like a whip. My husband died and left me with 2 children and debts I couldn't pay. I took the only help offered, signed papers I was told would save us, and tried to survive. If that's a crime, then every widow in this territory is guilty. You could have asked for help, from the church, from neighbors. I did ask. The words tore out of her, raw and furious. I asked, and you all looked the other way. You whispered about me behind closed doors, judged me for working, judged me for being alone, judged me for doing whatever it took to feed my children. And when I was pregnant and desperate and dying, you stood in a circle and watched. So don't you dare tell me I should have asked for help. I did. You just weren't listening." Morton's face went red, but he had no answer. Around him, people shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet Lila's eyes. Pastor Reynolds cleared his throat. "Perhaps this discussion would be better suited to where?" Lila cut him off. "To somewhere private where you can all pretend it didn't happen? Where you can convince yourselves you're good people who just happened to let a woman almost die because it was easier than showing mercy?" She looked around the sanctuary, meeting as many eyes as would hold her gaze. "I came here today because someone told me you needed to see I'm still standing, that I'm not ashamed, and I'm not. I'm not ashamed of surviving or of accepting help from a good man, or of this baby girl who's alive because one person decided her life mattered." Hope chose that moment to wake, her small cry piercing the silence. Lila adjusted her daughter, rocking gently, the automatic motion of motherhood taking over. "But I am angry," she continued, softer now, but no less fierce. "I'm angry that you call yourselves Christian while practicing cruelty. I'm angry that a corrupt banker can threaten me in a church, and half of you will nod along because it's easier than standing up. And I'm angry that my children have to learn these lessons about what people are really like when nobody's watching." Martha Conroy stood abruptly. "The girl's right to be angry. We should be ashamed." She looked around at her neighbors, her friends, her fellow congregation members. "I'm ashamed. I stood on that porch and watched, and I told myself it wasn't my business, that she'd brought it on herself. But the truth is I was afraid of being judged the way she was being judged, afraid of standing out, of being different, of having people look at me the way they were looking at her." Her voice broke. "And that fear made me cruel, made me a coward, and I'm sorry. It's not enough, but I'm sorry." The apology seemed to break something open in the room. Another woman stood, then another, voices overlapping in confession and regret. Not everyone, some remained stubbornly silent, convinced of their righteousness, but enough that Lila felt the air shift, felt something like possibility creeping in. Then a man stood in the back, someone Lila didn't recognize. "Mrs. Hart, I'm Thomas Brennan. I work at the telegraph office. Got a message 3 days ago. Thought you should know about it." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "It's addressed to Sheriff Dawson from the U.S. Marshal Service in Denver. Says they're looking for information about a Caleb Rourke, formerly a deputy marshal. Says he may be in this area." The room went cold. Lila felt Caleb go rigid beside her, felt the weight of history crashing down. "Why are you telling us this?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Because Dawson's going to act on it. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And I figured you deserved a warning." Brennan looked at Caleb. "I don't know what happened back in Denver, and I don't need to know. But you helped Mrs. Hart when no one else would. That counts for something." Caleb stood slowly, his face carefully blank. "Thank you for the warning." He turned to Lila. "We should go." But before they could move, the church doors opened again. This time it was Sheriff Dawson, his expression grim, a telegram in his hand identical to the one Brennan had just revealed. "Caleb Rourke," he said formally, officially, "I need you to come with me. The U.S. Marshal Service has questions about your whereabouts during a recent incident involving a wanted fugitive." "What incident?" Lila's voice was sharp with fear. Dawson's eyes flicked to her, something like pity in them. "Silas Crane was spotted 2 days ago in Cheyenne, killed a saloon keeper and disappeared. The marshals think Rourke might know where he'd run to, given their history." "I don't know where Crane is." Caleb's voice was flat, dead. "Haven't seen or heard from him since Boulder." "Then you can tell them that in person. There's a marshal arriving tomorrow on the noon train. He'll want to question you, and I'm to make sure you're available for questioning." Dawson shifted his weight. "I'm not arresting you, Rourke, just asking you to stay put. And if I don't, then I will arrest you, and it'll go a lot harder." The sheriff's tone gentled slightly. "This doesn't have to be ugly. Just talk to the marshal, answer his questions, and if you're clean, you're clean." Caleb looked at Lila, and she saw everything he wasn't saying. The fear that this was the reckoning he'd been running from, that helping her had finally caught up to him, that the past he'd tried to bury was about to consume them both. I'll stay, he said quietly. But I'm taking Mrs. Hart and her children home first. They don't need to be part of this. Dawson considered, then nodded. Tomorrow. Noon. Don't make me come looking for you. He left, and the congregation dissolved into whispers, speculation spreading like wildfire. Lila gathered her children, held Hope close, and walked out of the church with her head high and Caleb at her side. They didn't speak during the ride home. What was there to say? That she was terrified? That she couldn't lose him now, not when he'd become essential to their survival? That the thought of facing Webb, facing the courts, facing everything alone again, made her want to scream? When they reached the ranch, Caleb helped her down from the wagon, his hand steady despite everything. I'll talk to the marshal tomorrow. I'll explain about Crane, about why I left, about everything. It'll be fine. What if it's not? Lila heard the desperation in her own voice. What if they take you back to Denver? What if Crane... She couldn't finish. Then you fight without me. You take those papers to Halloway, you file the complaint, and you don't let Webb win. Caleb's hands framed her face, gentle and sure. You're stronger than you know, Lila Hart. You don't need me to survive this. Maybe not, she whispered. But I don't want to do it alone. His thumb brushed her cheek, catching a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. You're not alone. You've got your kids. You've got people in that church who are starting to remember their consciences, and you've got the law on your side, the real law, not Webb's version. He paused. And you've got me, for as long as that lasts. How long will it last? Caleb's smile was sad, resigned. I don't know, but I'm done running. Whatever happens tomorrow, I face it. No more hiding. That night, Lila lay awake listening to her children breathe, to Hope's small, snuffling sounds, to the wind moving through the cottonwoods outside. Somewhere in the barn, Caleb was doing the same, lying awake, facing his demons, preparing for a reckoning he couldn't avoid. And 2 days' ride away in Cheyenne, Silas Crane counted his money from the dead saloon keeper's till and planned his next move, unaware that his past was about to catch up with him in ways he couldn't imagine. The pieces were moving into position. The storm was gathering, and come tomorrow, everything would change. Morning came too fast and too slow, time behaving the way it did when you were dreading what daylight would bring. Lila woke to find Caleb already outside, working on the corral fence with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he needed his hands busy to keep his mind quiet. She watched him through the window while nursing Hope, memorizing the way he moved, efficient, precise, like a man who'd learned to make every motion count. Maggie appeared at her elbow, silent as smoke. Is Caleb leaving? I don't know, sweetheart. He shouldn't have to leave. He didn't do anything wrong, not to us. The girl's voice was fierce with the absolute certainty of childhood. It's not fair. No, Lila agreed quietly. It's not. They ate breakfast in near silence, the weight of noon hanging over everything. Caleb came in smelling of sawdust and sweat, washed his hands in the basin, sat down at the table like this was any other morning. But his eyes kept drifting to the clock on the mantel, watching the hands crawl toward their inevitable destination. At 11:30, he stood and reached for his hat. I should head into town. Don't want to be late. We're coming with you. Lila's tone left no room for argument. Lila, you stood with me in that church. You faced down Webb and half the town on my behalf. You think I'm going to let you walk into that sheriff's office alone? She was already moving, gathering the children, wrapping Hope in a light blanket. We're coming. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Gratitude, maybe, or resignation, or that complicated mix of both that came when someone refused to let you face your demons in solitude. All right, but you stay in the wagon. This isn't your fight. Everything that happens to you is my fight now. The words came out more fierce than she'd intended, carrying weight she hadn't meant to put on them. You made it that way when you stepped into that circle. They rode to town in tense silence, the landscape rolling past in shades of gold and green, mountains rising blue and distant in the west. Willow Creek appeared like a mirage, its single street dusty and quiet under the midday sun. A few people moved along the boardwalks, stopping to stare as Caleb's wagon passed, their faces reflecting various degrees of curiosity and judgment. The sheriff's office sat at the far end of town, a squat building with barred windows and a hitching post out front. 2 horses were already tied there, one Lila recognized as Dawson's roan, the other a tall bay with saddle worn smooth from long miles. The marshal had arrived early. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop, set the brake, climbed down with the careful movements of a man walking toward the gallows. "Remember what I said. Stay here. We'll be right here when you come out." Lila held his gaze, willing him to believe it. "However long it takes." He nodded once, touched the brim of his hat, and walked toward the office. His hand reached for the door, hesitated for just a moment, then pushed it open. The darkness inside swallowed him whole. Time crawled. Lila sat in the wagon with Hope in her arms, and her other children pressed close, trying not to imagine what was happening behind those walls. Questions, she told herself, just questions. They couldn't arrest him for something that happened 3 years ago when he'd been cleared of wrongdoing. They couldn't. The door opened and 3 men emerged. Dawson first, his face carefully neutral. Then a stranger, tall, weathered, wearing a martial star pinned to his vest and carrying himself with the authority of federal law. And finally, Caleb, walking between them, not in chains, but not exactly free either. Lila's heart seized. She started to climb down, but Caleb caught her eye and shook his head sharply. "Stay." The message was clear. The marshal, she could see him clearly now, a man in his 50s with gray threading his dark hair and eyes that had seen too much, stopped on the boardwalk and turned to Caleb. His voice carried in the still air. "I appreciate your cooperation, Rourke. You didn't have to come in, didn't have to answer my questions. That speaks well of you." "I'm done running, Marshal Pike." Caleb's voice was steady, resigned. "Whatever you need from me, I'll give it. But I need to know, is this about Crane, or is this about Marsh?" Pike's expression softened slightly. "Both, if I'm being honest. Crane's been active again, killed that saloon keeper in Cheyenne like Dawson told you, but there's more. We think he's working with others now, a whole operation running between here and Denver, and given your history with him, you think I might know his patterns, where he'd run, who he'd turn to." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I don't. I haven't thought about Silas Crane in 3 years except to hate myself for letting him get away." "I believe you, but there's something you should know." Pike pulled a paper from his coat, unfolded it carefully. "We got a tip 2 days ago. Anonymous letter delivered to the Denver office. Said Crane's been spotted in this area using the name Samuel Cross, working as a ranch hand. Said he's been watching you." The words landed like stones in still water. Lila felt ice crawl down her spine. Watching him. Here, close. Caleb went very still, the kind of stillness that came before violence. "Why would he watch me?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out. Could be revenge. You did nearly catch him 3 years ago, killed his partner, even if it was an accident. Could be he's planning something and you're a loose end." Pike paused. "Or could be he's using you as bait to draw out lawmen. Wouldn't be the first time a fugitive set a trap using someone from his past." "So what do you want from me?" "I want you to help me find him before he finds you." Pike's tone was matter-of-fact, professional. "You know how he thinks, how he operates. You might spot something we'd miss." "I'm not a marshal anymore." "No, but you were a good one. Before Marsh, you had one of the best records in the district. And you've got something Crane doesn't know you have, motivation that goes beyond a paycheck." Pike glanced toward the wagon, toward Lila and the children. "You've got people depending on you now. That makes a man careful, makes him think before he acts." Caleb followed Pike's gaze, his expression tightening when he saw Lila listening. "If Crane's watching me, then everyone near me is in danger. Which is why we need to move fast. I've got 2 deputies arriving tomorrow from Cheyenne, and Dawson here has agreed to assist. We'll start checking the ranches, looking for anyone matching Crane's description using the name Samuel Cross." Pike folded the paper, tucked it away. "But I need you to think, Rourke. Where would he go? What would he do? If he's planning something, what's his angle?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly working through possibilities, patterns, the psychology of a man he'd once hunted. Crane wasn't just violent, he was smart, calculating. He didn't take risks unless the payoff was big enough to justify them. His voice went distant, remembering. If he's here, If he's been watching, it's because he wants something specific, not just revenge, something concrete. Like what? Money, most likely. There was talk back in Boulder that he'd been planning a big score before I interrupted him. Payroll robbery? Or maybe a bank? Caleb's eyes narrowed. Is there anything like that happening around here? Anything that would draw someone looking for a big haul? Dawson and Pike exchanged glances. The railroad's bringing in payment for the land purchases next week, Dawson said slowly. Cash, not banknotes. About $10,000 from what I hear. It's supposed to be a secret, but secrets don't last in small towns, Caleb finished. Especially not when you've got someone like Marcus Webb involved, probably bragging about the deal to anyone who'll listen. Webb. Pike's expression sharpened. The banker who's been causing trouble for Mrs. Hart? The same. He's connected to the railroad purchase, been handling the land acquisitions. Caleb's jaw worked. If Crane's planning to hit that payroll, he'd need inside information. Someone who knows the routes, the timing. Someone who might be desperate enough or greedy enough to provide it. Pike looked at Dawson. We need to talk to Webb, quietly. See if anyone's been asking unusual questions. He's not going to cooperate, Dawson warned. Man thinks he owns this town. Then we don't ask. We watch. Pike turned back to Caleb. I need you to keep your normal routine. Don't change anything. Don't act like you know Crane might be near. If he is watching, we want him to think you're oblivious. Meanwhile, my deputies and I will work the ranches, find out where Cross is working. And if you find him, we take him, carefully. No heroics, no revenge. Pike's voice hardened. I know what Crane cost you, Rourke. I know you've been carrying Marsh's death like a stone around your neck. But you don't get to be the one who brings Crane in. You're too close to it, too compromised. You understand? Caleb's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. I understand. Good. Now go home. Take care of your... Pike paused, glancing again at the wagon. Take care of those people waiting for you. Stay alert, but don't do anything stupid. One more thing. Caleb's voice stopped Pike as he turned to leave. Mrs. Hart has legal troubles. Fraudulent contract, corrupt banker, threats of arrest. There's a judge in Larkspur, Halloway, who's willing to testify if it goes to court. But she needs protection from Webb while this is getting sorted. Pike studied Caleb for a moment, something knowing in his expression. You asking me to intervene in a local civil matter? I'm asking you to make sure a woman and 3 kids don't get railroaded by a man who's already tried to destroy her once. I'll look into it. Can't promise anything, but I'll look. Pike tipped his hat. Stay safe, Rourke, and stay smart. He and Dawson headed back inside, leaving Caleb standing alone on the boardwalk. For a moment, he just stood there, shoulders tight with tension, staring at nothing. Then he crossed to the wagon and climbed up beside Lila. Drive, she said quietly before he could speak. We can talk at home. He drove, and she held her silence until the town was behind them and the ranch was visible in the distance. Only then did she turn to face him. Crane's here. He's been watching you. It wasn't a question. Looks that way. And the marshal wants you to help catch him. He wants me to help figure out what Crane's planning. The catching part, that's for Pike and his deputies. Caleb's hands were tight on the reins. I'm supposed to stay out of it. But you won't. Lila heard the certainty in her own voice. If it comes down to it, if Crane comes for you or threatens us, you won't stay out of it. Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, no, I won't. Good. The word surprised them both. Lila shifted hope to her other arm, met Caleb's startled gaze. I don't want you to be noble or careful or any of those things that get good men killed. I want you to do whatever it takes to keep yourself and my children safe. Whatever it takes. You understand? Lila, I mean it, Caleb. I've already lost one man I cared about. I'm not losing another because he was too busy being honorable to survive. The admission hung between them, raw and unplanned. Cared about. Not loved, not yet, but close enough that the distinction barely mattered. Caleb stared at her, something breaking open in his expression. You shouldn't care about me, he said roughly. I'm a man with a past that's catching up to him, a future that's uncertain at best, and enemies who might use you to get to me. You should what? Send you away? Pretend I don't feel what I feel? Lila's laugh was sharp, edged with frustration. It's too late for that. You're already part of this family, whether either of us planned for it or not. My children trust you. I trust you. And that means we face what's coming together, not separately. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard, set the brake, turned to face her fully. If something happens to me, it won't. But if it does, you need to promise me something. Take the kids and go to Larkspur. Find Judge Holloway. He'll help you sort out the legal mess with Webb, get you protection if you need it. His voice was urgent, demanding. Promise me, Lila. I promise. But you have to promise me something too. She reached out, laid her hand over his. Promise me you won't throw your life away trying to make up for Daniel Marsh. That man is dead, and nothing you do now will change that. But you're alive, and these children need you, and... Her voice cracked. And I need you. So promise me you'll fight to stay alive, not just to redeem yourself. Caleb's hand turned beneath hers, fingers threading through hers, holding tight. I promise. They sat like that for a moment, hands clasped, both aware they were making vows that might be tested before the week was out. Then hope fussed, and the moment broke, reality rushing back in. That evening passed in strange normalcy. Caleb worked on the fence while Lila prepared dinner. The children played in the yard, their laughter drifting through the open windows. Hope nursed and slept and woke and nursed again with the tireless rhythm of the newborn. Everything was ordinary and nothing was ordinary, danger lurking just beyond the edges of their temporary peace. After the children were asleep, Lila found Caleb in the barn, checking his weapons. A rifle lay on the workbench beside a revolver, both cleaned and oiled with the care of someone who knew his life might depend on their function. He looked up as she entered, his expression guarded. You should be resting. I can't rest, not knowing what I know. Lila moved closer, watching his hands work, loading the revolver, checking the cylinder, movements so practiced they were nearly automatic. How long before Pike finds him? Could be days, could be hours. Depends on how careful Crane's being, how deep he's buried himself. Caleb set the revolver aside, picked up the rifle. But he'll make a mistake eventually. They always do. And when he does, what happens then? Pike arrests him, takes him back to Denver, and Crane stands trial for murder. Caleb's voice was flat, emotionless. Justice gets served, 3 years late, but better than never. You don't believe that? No. The admission was quiet, honest. I believe Crane will run or fight or both. I believe someone will probably die before this is over. And I believe... He stopped, jaw working. You believe it might be you, Lila finished. It should be me. If someone has to die to put Crane away, it should be the man who let him escape in the first place. Caleb set the rifle down carefully, his hands braced against the workbench. That's what justice looks like, isn't it? The scales balancing out. That's not justice. That's suicide with extra steps. Lila moved to stand beside him, close enough to feel the tension radiating off him like heat. Justice is Crane facing consequences for his crimes. You dying doesn't change what he's done or make up for what you did. It just means more people suffer. More people are already suffering. You because of Webb, Marcia's family because of me. How many more people have to pay for my mistakes before the debt is settled? It's not about debt. The words came out sharper than she'd intended. Frustration and fear mixing into something close to anger. You're not some ledger that needs balancing. You're a person, a good person who made one terrible mistake and has been punishing himself ever since. But martyrdom doesn't fix anything, Caleb. It just robs the world of someone who might actually make things better. He turned to look at her then, really look, and she saw the exhaustion in his face. Not physical tiredness, but the deep soul weariness of someone who'd been carrying too much weight for too long. I don't know how to stop, he admitted. Carrying it, I mean. It's been part of me for so long that I don't remember who I was before Marsh died. I just know who I became after. Someone running, someone hiding, someone waiting for the past to catch up. Then stop running. Stop hiding. Stop waiting. Lila reached up, framed his face with her hands the way he'd done for her days before. Start living instead. Here, with us, for as long as you've got. And when Crane comes, because he will come, you fight him like a man who has something to live for, not like a man looking for a noble way to die. Caleb's eyes closed, his breath shuddering out. What if I can't? What if when the moment comes, all I can see is Marsh falling? All I can feel is the weight of what I took from his family, and I freeze or hesitate, or then I'll be there to remind you. Lila's voice was fierce, absolute. I'll remind you of Maggie asking you about horses, and Ben wanting to help with the fence, and Hope sleeping safe in your house because you gave us shelter. I'll remind you that redemption isn't about dying for your mistakes, it's about living despite them. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Caleb's hands came up to cover hers, holding them against his face like an anchor. I don't deserve you, he whispered. Probably not, but you've got me anyway. She smiled, trying for lightness she didn't quite feel. So you'd better not die, because I'm not explaining to Maggie why the best man she's ever known decided his guilt was more important than her future. That got through. Caleb's eyes opened, meeting hers, and something in them shifted. Not resolution exactly, but maybe the beginning of it. She thinks I'm the best man she's ever known? She told me yesterday. Said you're teaching her to be steady, like the horses. Said she wants to be brave like you when she grows up. Lila's throat tightened. Don't make her learn that brave men die for things that don't matter. Teach her that brave men live for things that do. Caleb pulled her close then, wrapping his arms around her in a way that felt less like romance and more like desperation. Two people holding each other up against the weight of everything they were carrying. Lila leaned into him, felt the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, and let herself believe for just a moment that everything would be all right. They stood like that until Hope's cry drifted from the house, breaking the spell. Lila pulled back reluctantly, already moving toward the door. I should... Go. Take care of her. Caleb released her, already stepping back, rebuilding the walls. I'll finish up here and check the property, make sure everything's secure. Lila hesitated at the barn door, looking back at him. Caleb? Thank you. For everything, but especially for... She gestured vaguely, encompassing the conversation, the moment, the vulnerability he'd shown. For letting me see you. He nodded, and she left him there with his weapons and his ghosts, hoping she'd said enough to keep him fighting when the time came. The days that followed were tense, stretched thin with waiting. Marshal Pike and his deputies worked the surrounding ranches, interviewing hands, checking credentials, looking for any sign of Samuel Cross. They found nothing. No one matching Crane's description, no recent hires who seemed suspicious, no evidence that he'd ever been in the area. But Caleb knew better. He could feel eyes on him when he worked outside, could sense presence in the empty spaces between heartbeats. Crane was there, watching, waiting for his moment. The question was what that moment would be. On the fourth day, everything changed. Lila had gone into town with the children. A calculated risk, but one they'd agreed was necessary. She needed to file the formal complaint against Webb, needed to put the legal wheels in motion before his threats became action. Caleb had wanted to go with her, but Pike had insisted he stay at the ranch, maintain his routine, give Crane no reason to suspect they were hunting him. So he stayed, working on the barn roof that had needed patching since he'd bought the place, trying to ignore the crawling sensation between his shoulder blades that said he wasn't alone. The shot came just after noon. It wasn't aimed at him. The bullet punched through the barn wall 3 feet to his left, close enough to make him drop flat, but far enough away to be clearly intentional. A warning, not an attack. Caleb rolled, came up with his revolver drawn, scanning the tree line. Nothing. No movement, no second shot, just silence and the fading echo of gunfire. Then a voice, distant but clear, carried on the wind. Been a long time, deputy, or should I say ex-deputy. Silas Crane. Caleb would know that voice anywhere, smooth, educated, laced with the kind of casual cruelty that came naturally to some men. Show yourself, Caleb called back, not moving from cover. In a minute. First I want you to know I've been watching you, Rourke. Watched you play house with that widow and her brats. Watched you pretend you're some kind of hero instead of the man who murdered my partner in cold blood. Crane's voice moved, circling. You remember Danny Marsh, don't you? The man you shot? The name hit like a fist. Caleb's hands tightened on his weapon. Marsh wasn't your partner. He was an innocent man in the wrong place. You used him as a shield. I used him as an opportunity, same as you did, when you pulled that trigger. A pause loaded with malice. How's it feel, knowing you and I aren't so different? Both of us willing to kill for what we want. Both of us pretending we've got principles. We're nothing alike. No? You killed Marsh and walked away. I've killed a dozen men and done the same. The only difference is I don't cry about it afterward. Crane laughed, the sound wrong in the peaceful afternoon. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because you've got something I want. I don't have anything you could want. Sure you do. You've got that pretty widow, all trusting and grateful. You've got her heading into town right now with those kids, walking right past my associate who's waiting at the bank. The words dripped poison. You've got about 30 minutes before Marcus Webb finishes withdrawing the railroad payroll and my man makes his move. And you've got a choice, Rourke. Come after me or ride into town and try to save them. Ice flooded Caleb's veins. You're lying. Am I? Ask yourself, where's the marshal and his deputies? They're out checking the northern ranches right where I made sure they'd be. Who's protecting that bank? Just one drunk sheriff and whatever conscience Webb's got left. Another laugh. And your widow's there with her children, all of them soft targets if something goes wrong. If you hurt them, you'll what? Kill me? You already tried that once and shot the wrong man. You really want to risk it again? Crane's voice hardened. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay right there while I ride away. If you follow me, I'll make sure my man knows to take hostages. But if you go to town, try to play hero, I'll be long gone by the time you figure out I was bluffing about the bank. The choice was impossible, exactly as Crane had designed it. Stay and let a murderer escape again, or ride to town and possibly walk into a trap, leaving Crane free either way. Caleb thought about Pike's orders to stay put, to let the deputies handle it. He thought about his promise to Lila to fight smart, not to throw his life away. He thought about Maggie wanting to be steady like him, and Hope sleeping safe because he'd given them shelter. Then he thought about what would happen if Crane was telling the truth, and he did nothing. The decision took less than a second. Caleb ran for his horse. The horse sensed Caleb's urgency and ran like the ground was burning beneath its hooves. 3 miles of rough trail stretched between the ranch and town, and Caleb pushed every second, his mind racing faster than the landscape blurring past. Was Crane lying about the bank? Probably. Was he lying about having someone watching Lila and the children? That was the question that made Caleb's blood run cold, because men like Crane didn't bluff without backup plans. He hit the edge of town at full gallop, drawing stares from people on the boardwalks. The bank sat at the center of the main street, its brick facade solid and respectable. Through the window, Caleb could see movement, customers conducting business, Marcus Webb's distinctive profile behind the teller's cage. No sign of trouble. No sign of Lila either. Caleb pulled his horse to a stop, scanning the street. There. Lila's borrowed wagon outside the general store. Maggie visible through the window helping her mother carry packages. Relief hit him so hard he nearly swayed in the saddle, followed immediately by the sick realization that Crane had played him perfectly. He'd abandoned his position at the ranch exactly as Crane wanted, leaving the property unwatched and the fugitive free to disappear into the territories. He'd failed again. Let Crane slip away again. The pattern was so familiar it felt like destiny. Then he saw the man. Leaning against the post outside the telegraph office, hat pulled low, watching the bank with the focused stillness of someone waiting for a specific moment. Average height, average build. The kind of unremarkable that let a man fade into any crowd. But there was something in the way he stood, in the tension of his shoulders, that screamed wrong to anyone trained to see it. Caleb's hand moved to his revolver as the pieces clicked together. Crane hadn't been lying about the bank. He just lied about the timing. The robbery wasn't happening now. It was about to happen. And Lila and the children were 50 feet away, close enough to get caught in the crossfire if shooting started. The man at the telegraph office straightened, his attention sharpening. Inside the bank, Webb was closing a ledger, preparing to move the payroll. Any second now. Caleb dismounted fast and quiet, circling wide to approach the telegraph office from the side. He kept his movements casual, just another man stretching his legs after a ride, but his eyes never left the stranger. When he was close enough, he saw the bulge under the man's coat, the nervous way his hand kept drifting toward it. "Nice day," Caleb said conversationally, stopping 10 feet away. The man's head snapped toward him, eyes going wide, then narrow. "Move along." "Can't do that." See, I've got a problem. Caleb's voice stayed easy, unthreatening, even as his body coiled, ready to move. I'm trying to figure out if you're just a nervous fellow waiting for a telegram, or if you're the associate Silas Crane told me about. The name landed like a slap. The man's hand dove for his gun. Caleb was faster. His revolver cleared leather and fired in one smooth motion, the bullet punching through the man's shoulder and spinning him against the post. The gun fell from nerveless fingers, clattering to the boardwalk. Chaos erupted. Women screamed. Men dove for cover. Inside the bank, Webb's face appeared at the window, pale and shocked. And from the general store, Lila emerged with Maggie beside her, both of them frozen in horror at the sight of Caleb standing over a wounded man with a smoking gun. Sheriff Dawson came running from his office, weapon drawn, taking in the scene with the rapid assessment of long experience. Rourke, what the hell? Crane's man was waiting to hit the bank when Webb moved the payroll. Caleb kept his gun trained on the wounded man, who was gasping and clutching his shoulder. Check his pockets. You'll find a note with instructions. Dawson knelt, searched quickly, and came up with a folded paper. His expression darkened as he read. Says to take the money and ride north to a camp in the hills. Says Crane will meet him there. He looked up at Caleb. How did you know? Crane found me at the ranch, told me about this, tried to make me choose between chasing him or protecting Lila. I chose her. Caleb's voice was flat, empty of triumph. But he's gone now. Use this as a distraction to cover his escape. Maybe not. A new voice cut through the crowd. Marshal Pike, emerging from the alley beside the bank with his deputies flanking him. We weren't at the northern ranches, Rourke. We were here, watching the bank, waiting to see if Crane would make his move. Your shot just told us where to look. Hope flickered, fragile as candlelight. You think he's still close? I think he expected this to go differently. Expected his man to succeed, expected confusion and chaos to give him cover. Pike gestured to his deputies. Fan out. Check the livery, the hotel, anywhere someone could hole up waiting for a signal. And get Doc Harrison over here. This one's bleeding all over my evidence. The deputies scattered. Dawson hauled the wounded man to his feet, half carrying him toward the jail. Webb stood in the bank doorway, his earlier bluster replaced by genuine fear as he realized how close he'd come to disaster. And Lila was walking toward Caleb with hope in her arms and murder in her eyes. You promised, she said when she reached him, voice shaking with fury and relief and terror, all mixed together. You promised you wouldn't throw your life away, and the first chance you get, you ride into town and start a gunfight. I had to. He was going to rob the bank, and you were right there, and if shooting started... Caleb holstered his weapon, reached for her, then stopped himself. I couldn't let anything happen to you. So instead you nearly got yourself killed, Lila's voice cracked. Do you have any idea what it was like hearing that shot and turning around to see you standing there with a gun? To think for one horrible second that you'd been hit, that you were... She couldn't finish. The fear that had been riding her since Crane's name first came up finally broke through her composure, and she swayed, suddenly unsteady. Caleb caught her, one arm supporting her waist while the other reached for hope. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, but I couldn't... If something had happened to you because I stayed at the ranch like Pike ordered, I know... Lila sagged against him, exhaustion and emotion overwhelming her carefully maintained strength. I know, and I hate that I understand, but Caleb, we can't keep doing this. Living in fear, waiting for the next crisis, wondering if each goodbye might be the last one. It's almost over. He held her carefully, aware of the baby between them, aware of the crowd watching. Pike's got Crane's man, and that means he's got leverage, a way to find Crane's camp, to end this. You really believe that? Lila pulled back enough to meet his eyes. Or are you just telling me what I need to hear? Before Caleb could answer, Pike returned at a run. Got him. One of my deputies spotted a man matching Crane's description at the livery, trying to saddle a horse. He saw us coming and bolted toward the hills on foot. On foot? Caleb's mind raced, mapping terrain. He won't get far in those hills without a horse. Too much open ground? Too many places to get cornered. Exactly. Which is why I need you to stay here with Mrs. Hart and let us handle this. Pike's tone was firm, leaving no room for argument. You've done enough, Rourke. More than enough. Now let the law finish it. Every instinct Caleb had screamed to argue, to follow, to be there when Crane finally faced justice. But he looked at Lila's pale face, at Hope sleeping peacefully against her mother's shoulder, at Maggie and Ben watching from the store window with wide, frightened eyes, and he knew what the right choice was. "Go," he said quietly. "End it." Pike nodded once, sharp and approving, then took off toward the hills with his deputies. Within minutes, most of the able-bodied men in town had joined the pursuit, drawn by the promise of justice and the excitement of a manhunt. Even Webb, trying to rebuild his shattered authority, went along. Caleb guided Lila and the children to the wagon, helped them inside, then climbed up beside her. "Let's go home." "What about Crane? What if he—" "Pike will handle it. He's got a dozen men, Crane's on foot in unfamiliar territory, and there's nowhere to run." Caleb took up the reins, his hands steady despite the adrenaline still singing through his blood. "It's over, Lila. One way or another, it's over." They rode in silence, the tension slowly draining as distance grew between them and the town. By the time the ranch appeared on the horizon, Lila had stopped shaking, and the children had stopped asking questions Caleb didn't have answers for. But the peace didn't last. They'd barely pulled into the yard when Caleb saw it, his front door standing open, the interior dark and wrong. He'd locked that door before leaving. He always locked it. "Stay in the wagon," he ordered, already moving. "Caleb, stay here." He drew his revolver, approaching the house with careful steps, eyes scanning for movement. The door swung wider as he reached it, revealing the interior, furniture overturned, drawers pulled open, his few possessions scattered like someone had been searching for something specific. A trap. The bank, the shooting, Pike's pursuit. All of it had been misdirection. Crane had never planned to rob the bank or run to the hills. He'd planned to draw everyone away so he could do this, whatever this was. Caleb stepped inside, weapon raised, clearing each room with practiced efficiency. Empty. All empty. No sign of Crane, no indication of what he'd been looking for. Then he saw it. On the kitchen table, weighted down with his own coffee cup, a single piece of paper covered in familiar handwriting. "You made me into a killer, Rourke. Now I'm going to return the favor. The widow's pretty. Shame about what's going to happen to her." Ice flooded Caleb's veins. He spun toward the door just as hoofbeats sounded in the yard. Not Pike returning? Wrong direction, wrong rhythm. A single rider, moving fast. He burst outside to find Lila climbing down from the wagon, Hope in her arms, Maggie and Ben behind her. And riding toward them from the tree line, a gun in his hand and murder in his eyes, was Silas Crane. "Get back!" Caleb shouted, but it was too late. Crane was already there, his horse between Caleb and Lila, weapon trained on the woman and children with steady purpose. "Told you we weren't so different," Crane said calmly. "Both of us willing to do whatever it takes. Difference is, I don't pretend to have limits." Caleb's gun was still in his hand, but the angle was wrong. Lila and the children too close to risk a shot. "You don't want them. You want me. Let them go." "I want you to suffer the way I've suffered." Crane's smile was cold, empty of anything human. 3 years running because of you. 3 years looking over my shoulder, changing names, living like a rat in the walls. You took that from me. Now I'm taking everything from you. I'll go with you, right now. No fight, no resistance. Just let them walk away. And miss the look on your face when I pull this trigger? Not a chance. Crane cocked the hammer, the click obscenely loud in the afternoon stillness. Lila did something then that Caleb would remember for the rest of his life. Instead of freezing or begging or trying to shield her children with her body, she looked Crane dead in the eye and said, "You're the man who killed Daniel Marsh." The words stopped Crane cold. "What?" "Daniel Marsh, the prospector, the father of 3, the man who died because you used him as a shield." Lila's voice was steady, clear, cutting through fear with pure will. "Caleb's been carrying that death for 3 years, punishing himself for a mistake you caused. But you don't even remember Marsh's name, do you? You've killed so many people they've all blurred together." "Shut up." Crane's gun hand wavered slightly. "How many children lost their fathers because of you? How many wives became widows? How many lives did you destroy and then forget about before the bodies were even cold?" Lila took a step forward, one small step, and Crane's horse shifted. You want Caleb to suffer? You want him to know what it feels like to lose everything? Then you're wasting your time because he already knows. He's lived with that pain every single day since Marsh died. And you... Another step. You don't even care enough to remember their names. I said shut up. Crane's composure was cracking, rage bleeding through. Caleb saw his opening, saw Lila creating it deliberately, drawing Crane's attention, making him angry enough to lose focus. She was giving Caleb a gift wrapped in her own courage, and he couldn't waste it. He moved. The shot and Caleb's movement happened simultaneously. Crane's bullet went wide, missing Lila by inches as Caleb's tackle took him off his horse. They hit the ground hard, Crane's gun flying from his hand, both men rolling and struggling for dominance. Caleb got his hands around Crane's throat and squeezed, 3 years of guilt and rage and self-hatred pouring into his grip. Crane's face went red, then purple, his hands clawing uselessly at Caleb's arms. "Caleb, stop!" Lila's voice cut through the haze of violence. "Don't do this! Don't become what he is!" But Caleb couldn't stop, didn't want to stop. This was justice, finally, the scales balancing after 3 years of watching them tip the wrong direction. One more second, and Crane would be dead, and Daniel Marsh would be avenged, and then what? Caleb would be a murderer. Not accidentally, not in the heat of a raid gone wrong, but deliberately, with full knowledge and intent. He'd become exactly what he'd been running from. His hands loosened. Crane gasped, sucking air, still alive. "That's right," Lila said softly. "Let him breathe. Let him face trial. Let Daniel Marsh's family see justice served properly, not through more killing." Caleb rolled away, breathing hard, staring at the man who'd haunted his nightmares for 3 years. Crane looked smaller now, more pathetic. Just another broken criminal instead of the demon Caleb had built him into. Hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Pike and his deputies, drawn by the gunshot. They took in the scene quickly, Crane on the ground, gasping, Caleb kneeling nearby, unarmed. Lila standing with her children, pale but unharmed. "Looks like you caught him for us," Pike said, dismounting. "Appreciate the assist." "He caught himself," Caleb's voice was hoarse. "I just stopped him from leaving." 2 deputies hauled Crane to his feet, shackled his hands, started reading charges that would see him hanged. Crane didn't fight, didn't speak, just stared at Caleb with hate-filled eyes as they dragged him toward their horses. Pike approached Caleb, offered a hand up. "You all right?" "I almost killed him." The admission came out raw. "Had my hands around his throat, and I wanted him dead more than I've wanted anything." "But you didn't kill him. That's what matters." Pike's grip was firm, grounding. "You chose justice over revenge. That takes more strength than pulling a trigger ever could." Caleb looked at Lila, saw her watching him with something like pride in her eyes, and felt the weight he'd been carrying shift slightly. Not gone. It would never be entirely gone, but lighter, manageable. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now Crane goes to Denver, stands trial, and hangs for his crimes. You'll likely be called to testify, given your history with him." Pike paused. "But that's in the future. Right now, I'd suggest you focus on the present, on the people who need you here." He meant Lila and the children. Caleb knew it. Pike knew it. Probably everyone within 100 miles knew it. "One more thing," Pike added. "I had a conversation with Marcus Webb during the pursuit. Seems he's suddenly very motivated to resolve Mrs. Hart's legal troubles without going to court. Something about not wanting his business practices examined too closely by a federal marshal." "He's dropping the charges?" Lila's voice was sharp with disbelief. "He's canceling the debt and signing over clear title to the land you thought you'd sold. Turns out the contract really was fraudulent, and once he realized I was willing to investigate, he decided cooperation was his best option." Pike's smile was thin. "Sometimes justice comes from unexpected directions." Lila sagged slightly, the news too good to process all at once. I can't." "You're free," Caleb said quietly. "No debt, no arrest warrant, no Webb holding your past over your head. It's over." The deputies rode out with Crane secured between them, taking with them 3 years of guilt and fear and running. Pike followed last, tipping his hat to Lila, nodding to Caleb with the respect due from one lawman to another, even a former one. And then they were alone. just Lila and Caleb and 3 children in a yard marked by violence but not defined by it. "You saved us," Maggie said into the silence, her small voice carrying absolute certainty. "You saved Mama again." "Your Mama saved herself this time." Caleb couldn't quite look at Lila, couldn't quite process what she'd done. "She was braver than anyone I've ever known." "I was terrified," Lila admitted. "I've never been so scared in my life, but I knew if I froze, if I let fear win, we'd all die. So I chose to fight instead." She shifted hope to her other arm, met Caleb's eyes. "I learned that from you. How to stand up when running seems easier. How to choose courage over comfort." "I didn't teach you that. You already knew it." Caleb moved closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. "You've been fighting since the day I met you. Fighting to survive, fighting to protect your children, fighting for dignity in a world that wanted to strip it away. All I did was show me I didn't have to fight alone." Lila's voice softened. "You stood with me when no one else would. You gave me shelter when I had nowhere to go. You faced down your worst nightmare to keep my children safe. That's not nothing, Caleb. That's everything." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning that went beyond gratitude or friendship into territory neither of them had quite acknowledged yet. "Mama," Maggie said tentatively, "is Caleb going to stay? Or is he leaving like everyone else leaves?" The question cut to the heart of it. Caleb looked at this makeshift family he'd somehow acquired, a widow and 3 children who'd become essential to his existence without him quite noticing when it happened. He thought about the ranch that still needed work, about fences that needed mending, and a future that suddenly seemed possible instead of punishment. He thought about Lila's courage and Maggie's trust, and Ben's hero worship, and Hope's absolute faith that the world would provide what she needed. He thought about what Pike had said about choosing justice over revenge, and what Lila had said about living for things that mattered instead of dying for things that didn't. And he made his choice. "I'm staying," he said simply, "if you'll have me. If you want—" He stopped, suddenly uncertain. "If you think we could build something here, all of us together." Lila's smile broke across her face like sunrise, transforming exhaustion into joy. "I think we already have built something. We just needed to survive long enough to see it clearly." "Then I'm staying," Caleb repeated, and this time it felt like a vow. The days that followed were busy ones. Pike returned to Denver with Crane in chains and a promise to keep Caleb informed of the trial. Webb, his corruption exposed and his influence shattered, quietly left town before anyone could organize a proper investigation. Judge Holloway filed the paperwork that cleared Lila's debts and restored her land rights, and for the first time since Thomas died, she owned something free and clear. But the biggest change came on a quiet Sunday morning 3 weeks after Crane's arrest. Lila stood in the same church where she'd once been judged, wearing the same blue dress, carrying Hope in her arms. This time, though, Caleb stood beside her, and Pastor Reynolds was reading vows instead of delivering sermons about sin. "Do you, Caleb Rourke, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward?" Caleb looked at Lila, at the woman who'd faced down a murderer to save his life, who'd chosen courage when terror would have been justified, who'd offered him redemption through living instead of dying. "I do." "And do you, Lila Hart, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward?" Lila thought about the circle in the dirt, about bleeding out while strangers watched, about a man who'd stepped forward when everyone else had turned away. She thought about second chances and chosen families and love that grew from crisis into something stronger than either of them could have built alone. "I do." The kiss was gentle, appropriate for a church, but it carried the weight of everything they'd survived to reach this moment. When they pulled apart, Maggie and Ben were beaming, and even Hope seemed to sense that something important had just happened, her small face scrunched in what might have been a smile. The congregation, smaller than before, Webb's departure having taken some of the crueler members with him, applauded. Mrs. Yates was crying openly. Martha Conroy's daughter threw flower petals despite having been told to wait until after the ceremony. It was messy and imperfect and exactly right. They walked out of the church together, not as widow and drifter but as husband and wife, ready to build a life from the ashes of what they'd lost. Some people still whispered, still judged, but their voices carried less weight now. Lila had learned that shame only had power if you accepted it, and she was done accepting anything less than dignity. The years that followed weren't easy. The ranch demanded constant work, money was often tight, and the memories of what they'd survived never fully faded. But they built something solid anyway, a home where children could laugh without fear, where mistakes were acknowledged but not condemned, where love was measured in daily choices rather than grand gestures. Maggie grew up steady and strong, just like she'd wanted, eventually teaching school in a nearby town. Ben became a rancher himself, taking over the property when Caleb's knees couldn't handle the work anymore. Hope, who'd been born in blood and cruelty and terror, grew into a woman who fought for justice with the same fierce courage her mother had shown, becoming a lawyer who specialized in helping widows navigate the legal systems designed to exploit them. And Caleb and Lila? They grew old together, their bodies wearing down but their bond only strengthening. On warm evenings, they'd sit on the porch and watch the sunset paint the mountains gold, holding hands like young lovers despite the decades between their wedding and the present moment. "Do you ever regret it?" Lila asked one such evening, her hair silver now but her eyes still bright. "Staying here instead of going back to the marshal service? Pike said you could have had your badge back after the trial." Caleb was quiet for a moment, considering. "I regret Daniel Marsh every single day. That never goes away. But staying here? Marrying you? Building this life with you and the kids?" He squeezed her hand gently. "That's the only thing I've never regretted. Not once. Not even for a second." "Good answer." Lila leaned her head on his shoulder, comfortable in the silence that came from truly knowing another person. "I love you, you know. Even when you're stubborn and ridiculous and insist on fixing fences in weather that would kill a younger man. I love you too. Even when you're bossy and judgmental and won't let me eat more than one piece of pie at dinner." They sat like that as darkness fell, two people who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances and somehow built the best possible life. Around them, the ranch settled into evening, horses moving in the corral, chickens roosting in the coop, the creek singing its endless song to the stones. Years later, when they were both gone and their children were old themselves, Maggie would tell her grandchildren the story of how a woman nearly died in the dirt, and a stranger said, "Nobody's dying today," and meant it. She'd tell them about courage and redemption, about love that chose to stand when walking away would have been easier, about families built not from blood alone, but from the daily decision to show up for each other. And she'd end the story the same way every time, with words her mother had taught her. What saved them wasn't luck or fate or divine intervention. It was one man stopping when everyone else walked away, and one woman deciding she would never be broken again. Remember that. When the world tries to make you small, when people tell you you're not worth saving, when everything seems impossible, remember that courage is a choice, and sometimes one person making that choice is enough to change everything. The story would spread the way good stories do, becoming legend and then myth, and finally, the kind of truth that transcends facts. But for Lila and Caleb, in those golden years before age claimed them, the only truth that mattered was this. They had found each other in darkness and built light together. They had turned a moment of cruelty into a lifetime of kindness. They had proved that the worst moments of our lives don't have to define us, unless we let them. And they never, ever let them. On a bright morning in spring, decades after that terrible day in the dirt, Lila Hart Rourke took her last breath with her family surrounding her. Caleb held her hand, whispering words of love that had worn smooth with repetition but had never lost their meaning. She smiled at him, squeezed back with what strength remained, and closed her eyes. She'd fought hard to stay alive that day outside Morton's store, fought even harder to build a life worth living afterward. Now, with that life complete and rich and full beyond anything she could have imagined in her darkest moments, she could finally rest. Caleb followed her 6 months later, his body simply giving up without her there to share the days. They buried him beside her on the hill overlooking the ranch, beneath a cottonwood tree they'd planted together their first spring. The headstone was simple, bearing both their names and one line that said everything that needed saying. "Nobody's dying today. and we meant it. Years became decades, became generations, but the story persisted. Because some stories deserve to persist. Because sometimes the world needs to be reminded that cruelty doesn't have to win, that strangers can become family, that one moment of courage can ripple forward through time, changing lives that haven't even been lived yet. And because in the end, Lila Hart and Caleb Rourke proved something that people desperately needed to believe, that it's never too late to start over, never too late to choose differently, never too late to stand up and say with absolute conviction, nobody's dying today. Not on my watch. Not while I'm still standing. Not ever again.